The wind howled through the desolate landscape, bending the tall grass in the meadow as if whispering a secret to the earth. Nathan Carter adjusted the collar of his worn-out jacket and kept walking, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. He wasn't used to venturing this far from his cabin, but something had drawn him here today, an unshakable sense of unease, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As he stepped over a fallen branch, his eyes caught something unusual near the edge of the marsh. At first, it looked like just another pile of debris left by the recent storm, but as he moved closer, a shiver ran down his spine. It was a dog, barely alive, its body caked in mud and water, its ribs faintly rising and falling with shallow breaths. Nathan knelt beside the animal, hesitating. The dog's fur was matted, covered in grime, and its frame was frighteningly thin. Yet despite its broken state, its eyes remained sharp, two gleaming amber orbs that locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill through him. Jesus! Nathan muttered under his breath. He had seen stray dogs before, but something about this one was different. There was no panic, no fear in its gaze, only a silent endurance, as if it had survived something far worse than abandonment. For a fleeting moment he considered leaving it. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't a rescuer, and he certainly wasn't looking for companionship. His life in the remote wilderness was one of solitude, and he preferred it that way. But something about those eyes wouldn't let him walk away. With a sigh, he shrugged off his coat and gently wrapped it around the dog's frail body. The animal didn't resist, nor did it react with the desperation he expected from a creature at death's door. It simply allowed itself to be lifted, its head resting weakly against his arm. The journey back to his cabin felt longer than usual, each step weighed down by the burden in his arms and the uncertainty in his mind. He had no idea how to care for an animal in this condition. Would it even survive the night? By the time Nathan reached his cabin, the dog had stopped shivering, but its breathing remained ragged. He carefully laid it on a pile of old blankets near the fireplace, then hurried to heat some water. His cabin was simple. A single room with a wooden table, a few shelves, and a bed pushed up against the wall. He hadn't needed much to live on, and that suited him fine. Now, for the first time in years, he had company. As the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, Nathan knelt beside the dog again. He used a damp cloth to clean the filth from its fur, revealing a coat that had once been a deep shade of black, now dulled from exposure to the elements. Scars marred its body, old wounds that hinted at a violent past. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he murmured, half to himself. The dog didn't respond, but its eyes remained open, watching him with that same unsettling awareness. Nathan sighed and leaned back against the wooden floor. He had no idea what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: he couldn't let the animal die. As the night deepened, the storm outside picked up again, rain pattering against the cabin's tin roof. Nathan sat in silence, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Every so often, the dog's breathing would hitch, and he would glance over, half expecting it to slip away. But it didn't. Hours passed, and as exhaustion crept in, he found himself drifting into uneasy sleep. Then, in the dead of night, a sound woke him. It wasn't the wind, nor the rain. It was the dog. Not whining, not whimpering, listening. Its ears twitched, head slightly lifted, body tense. Nathan followed its gaze toward the window, but there was nothing outside except the darkness of the forest. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. Something was out there, and whatever it was, the dog had been expecting it. Nathan sat up slowly, his muscles tensed as he followed the dog's gaze to the window. The storm outside howled, sending sheets of rain against the glass, but beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. Still, the dog remained rigid, its ears perked, nostrils flaring slightly as if catching a scent in the air. Nathan reached for the old hunting rifle leaning against the wall. He hadn't needed it in years. His life of solitude didn't invite trouble, but something about the way the dog reacted set his instincts on edge. "Easy boy," he murmured, barely realizing he'd called the dog that. The animal didn't move, its amber eyes locked on the window. The fire flickered in the dimly lit cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Nathan strained his ears, trying to pick up anything over the storm, but there was nothing distinct. Just the wind. Minutes passed. The dog's body remained tense, but it eventually settled back down, resting its head on its front paws. It wasn't fear in its posture, it was discipline. Alertness. Nathan let out a slow breath, setting the rifle back against the wall. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the dog was just overly cautious after whatever hell it had been through. Still, he didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ground soaked and the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Nathan stepped outside, scanning the treeline. Nothing seemed out of place, but he couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. Back inside, the dog stirred, lifting its head when Nathan approached. Its eyes were clearer now, though its body was still weak. "All right?" Nathan muttered, squatting down in front of it. "Time to figure out what to do with you." He grabbed a bowl, filled it with some leftover broth, and placed it in front of the dog. It hesitated, then slowly leaned forward, lapping at the liquid. Nathan watched, still unsettled by the dog's strange behavior. The way it moved, the way it reacted to sounds. It wasn't like any stray he'd ever seen. Then he noticed something. As the dog shifted slightly, a glint of metal caught his eye beneath its matted fur. Frowning, Nathan leaned in and carefully pushed some of the fur aside. Collar. Not just any collar, this one was reinforced with a thick, durable material, the kind used for military or law enforcement K9s. And engraved on the metal tag attached to it was a single name. Shadow. Nathan's stomach tightened. A military dog. That explained a lot. The discipline, the scars, the way it seemed trained to listen rather than panic. But how did a dog like this end up half dead in a swamp? Shadow finished the broth and slowly lay down again, resting but still keeping one eye open. Nathan sat back on his heels, rubbing a hand down his face. "Well, Shadow," he muttered. "Looks like you've got a story to tell." The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Nathan kept to his routine, chopping wood, checking his food stores, keeping an eye on the land. Shadow recovered slowly, regaining strength with each meal. Though still weak, the dog started moving around the cabin, inspecting every corner with cautious precision. But the biggest change was how it reacted to Nathan. It never barked, never whimpered, never begged for attention. Simply observed him, always watching, always aware. And every night, without fail, it listened. Nathan started to notice patterns. Shadow wasn't just reacting to random sounds, it was analyzing them, separating natural noises from something else. And sometimes, late at night, its ears would perk at something just beyond the treeline. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Something or someone was out there. On the fourth morning, Nathan found the tracks. At first, they were barely noticeable, subtle impressions in the damp earth, mostly washed away by the rain. But as he scanned the area near the meadow where he'd found Shadow, he saw them more clearly. Bootprints. Deep, fresh. Someone had been here. Nathan crouched down, tracing the edges of the imprints. Too large for a single person. There had been at least two, maybe more. And the way the prints were spread out suggested they weren't just wandering through. They had been searching for something. Or someone. His grip tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder. When he looked back at the cabin, Shadow was standing at the door, watching him. Nathan exhaled slowly. Whoever these people were, they weren't just passing through. And if Shadow was what he suspected, a military asset gone missing, then trouble was coming straight to his doorstep. Nathan moved cautiously through the damp undergrowth, his mind racing. The boot prints he had found near the meadow weren't just the tracks of lost hikers or passing hunters. They were deliberate, methodical. Someone was looking for something, or someone, and considering the circumstances, it wasn't hard to guess that Shadow was the reason. He glanced back toward the cabin, where the black-furred dog stood at the open door, watching him with those keen, intelligent eyes. Shadow had been on edge since the night Nathan found him. More so than a typical stray should be. Now, with proof that strangers were nearby, Nathan had even more questions. Who had left Shadow to die? And who was trying to find him now? He needed answers. Returning to the cabin, Nathan gave Shadow a firm look. "All right, boy. I think it's time we had a talk." The dog tilted its head slightly, as if understanding. Nathan grabbed an old hunting knife from the shelf and sat on the floor beside Shadow. Carefully, he pushed away more of the matted fur around the collar, inspecting it more closely. The reinforced fabric was sturdy, built to last through rough conditions. The metal tag still bore the single name, Shadow, but when Nathan ran his fingers along the underside, he felt something else. Something hidden beneath a layer of grime. He rubbed the dirt away. Etched into the metal was a series of numbers and letters. So C. K. 982 do not remove. Nathan frowned. SSC. Special Operations Command. Shadow remained still, watching him. If this dog had been part of a military unit, then why had it been abandoned? He had heard of war dogs being retired, but something about this felt different. If the people looking for Shadow were part of the government or military, they wouldn't be sneaking around in the woods. They would have knocked on his damn door. This was something else. A sharp rustling in the trees made Nathan's instincts flare. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle by his side. The sound was distant, but it wasn't natural. Not the shuffle of wind through branches or the footsteps of an animal. It was controlled movement. Someone was out there, trying not to be heard. Nathan's pulse quickened. He turned to Shadow. "Inside. Now." The dog hesitated for a fraction of a second, then obeyed, slipping silently into the cabin. Nathan followed, shutting the door without making a sound. He moved to the window, carefully parting the curtain just enough to see outside. For a few tense moments, there was nothing. Then a figure emerged from the trees. Dressed in dark tactical gear, the person moved with practiced precision, scanning the area before signaling behind him. Two more figures appeared, their heads on a swivel, sweeping the landscape with their eyes. Nathan's jaw tightened. These weren't hunters. They weren't park rangers. They were trained, armed, and looking for something. Shadow's body was tense beside him, eyes locked on the figures outside. The dog didn't growl or make a sound, but its muscles were coiled like a spring ready to snap. Nathan took a deep breath, keeping his grip steady on the rifle. He had spent years away from people, avoiding the chaos of the outside world. But trouble had found him anyway, and now he had to make a decision. The men outside moved slowly, methodically searching the area around the meadow. One of them knelt, inspecting something on the ground, probably the boot prints Nathan himself had left earlier. Then, the man lifted his head and turned in the direction of the cabin. Nathan ducked back from the window, his heart pounding. They knew someone was here. His mind raced through his options. If they were just here for Shadow, they wouldn't be knocking. If they were willing to abandon the dog in the first place, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate loose ends. He had to move. Quickly, Nathan grabbed a small bag from under his bed and stuffed it with essentials. Ammo, a flashlight, a water canteen. He couldn't take much, but if he stayed, he'd be trapped. Shadow remained near the door, ears flicking at the sounds outside. Nathan knelt beside him. "I don't know what kind of mess you got into, but it looks like we're both in it now." The dog held his gaze for a long moment. Then, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, Shadow turned toward the back door, waiting. Nathan exhaled. "All right, let's move." He opened the door just as the first knock hit the front. They were out of time. Nathan barely had time to slip out the back before another knock, louder this time, echoed through the cabin. The moment he and Shadow stepped into the wet grass, he could hear the men outside exchanging hushed words. "They're here. Check the windows." He had minutes, maybe seconds, before they figured out he was gone. Nathan gritted his teeth and signaled for Shadow to follow as he moved quickly into the treeline. He kept low, his movements practiced from years of hunting in these woods. The rain from the storm had softened the ground, making it easier to move quietly. Behind them, the front door creaked open. Clear. No one inside? Negative. But someone's been here. Woodpiles fresh. Fire's been used recently. A pause. Then, the dog was here. Tracks lead out back. Nathan swore under his breath and picked up the pace, weaving through the trees. Shadow moved beside him with unnatural silence. His body low, head turning every few seconds as if listening to every detail in the environment. The men weren't amateurs. They had found the trail fast, too fast. Nathan forced himself to think. He had the advantage, he knew these woods, and they didn't. But they had numbers and weapons, and the way they were tracking him told him they weren't going to give up easily. Shadow suddenly stopped, ears flicking back. Nathan halted, following the dog's gaze toward a rocky outcrop to their right. It wasn't just a pile of stones. There was a small crevice behind it, one he had used in the past to store hunting supplies. A hiding spot. Nathan crouched and whispered, "In." Shadow didn't hesitate. The dog slipped through the narrow gap without a sound, disappearing into the darkness. Nathan followed, pressing himself into the cold, damp space just as the first set of boots crunched into the undergrowth nearby. Footsteps stop here. A flashlight beam swept across the trees, barely missing their hiding place. Nathan held his breath. He knows the terrain. Another voice answered, deeper, authoritative. Doesn't matter. We keep moving. The dog's injured, can't keep up forever. Fan out, but stay close. Nathan listened as the boots moved further into the woods. They weren't giving up. The seconds stretched into minutes. Rain dripped from the leaves above, masking the sound of his breathing. Shadow remained completely still beside him, as if sensing the danger. Then, a voice crackled through a radio. "This is Bravo Team. We've got movement east of your position. Copy that. Moving to intercept." Nathan clenched his jaw. Someone or something had drawn them away. He wasn't about to waste the opportunity. He leaned down, whispering, "Go!" Shadow slipped out first, and Nathan followed, moving carefully through the foliage. They needed to put more distance between them and the search team before they could regroup. As they climbed higher into the forested hills, Nathan's mind raced. Who were these people? If they were government, they weren't acting like it. Their tactics were precise, but they lacked the open presence that military teams used for official recoveries. They were hunting something they didn't want the world to know about, and that made Shadow even more of a mystery. Nathan stopped near a fallen tree, taking a moment to catch his breath. Shadow sat beside him, his breathing steady, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "What the hell were you a part of?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but the way the dog looked at him, there was something there, an understanding. Nathan shook his head. Questions would have to wait. Right now, they needed to survive the night. The hunt wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Nathan pressed his back against the thick trunk of an ancient oak, his breath steady but controlled. The search team was still moving somewhere below, their footsteps a distant rhythm in the damp earth. They hadn't given up, not yet. Beside him, Shadow remained poised, ears flicking at the slightest sound. The dog's instincts were sharper than any hunter Nathan had ever seen. Shadow wasn't just trained, he was something more. Nathan exhaled slowly. They had put some distance between themselves and the cabin, but that wasn't going to be enough. If these men had radios, drones, or thermal equipment, they could track them even in the dark. He crouched beside Shadow and whispered, "We need a plan." Shadow didn't react, but Nathan could almost feel the dog's tension. As if he understood the stakes. Nathan thought fast. If they stayed in the woods, they'd be hunted down. His cabin was compromised. That left one option, getting out of the area entirely. He knew these mountains. There were old trails, abandoned logging roads, places where a man could disappear if he knew where to go. The problem was getting there before their pursuers closed in. Nathan signaled to Shadow and moved quickly but carefully through the trees. He was heading for an old riverbed about a mile west. If they could reach it, they could follow the water downstream and put even more distance between them and the search team. But they weren't the only ones moving. As they neared the riverbed, Shadow suddenly stopped, ears flat, body tense. Nathan followed the dog's gaze and saw a flicker of movement ahead, low to the ground, but deliberate. Someone was waiting for them. Nathan slowly reached for his rifle. If they had already anticipated his movements, then they were smarter than he thought. Then the voice came. "You don't have to run, Carter." Nathan froze. The voice was deep, calm, almost too relaxed for a man in the middle of a manhunt. "I know you can hear me," the voice continued, "and I know you have the dog." Nathan kept his grip firm on the rifle but didn't respond. The man sighed. "We just want what belongs to us. You give us the dog, and you walk away." Shadow's body tensed beside him, a low vibration running through his chest. A growl, but barely audible. Nathan's mind raced. These men had never announced themselves before. No warnings, no negotiations, just tracking and pursuit. Now they wanted to talk? That meant they were running out of options. Nathan exhaled. "And what happens to the dog?" A pause. "That's not your concern." Wrong answer. Nathan turned and whispered to Shadow, "Move on my signal." The dog didn't even look at him, just gave the faintest twitch of its tail, acknowledging the order. Nathan took a deep breath, then called out, "You left him to die. Why do you want him back now?" The man's voice came closer. "Because that dog is worth more than you realize." Nathan felt his pulse quicken. That confirmed it. Shadow wasn't just military. He was something beyond standard operations. "You don't want to do this, Carter," the voice warned. Nathan smirked. "That's where you're wrong." Then he moved. A quick roll to the side, raising the rifle as he went. He barely caught sight of the man, dark clothing, a tactical vest, before he fired a single shot into the dirt at his feet. The man flinched, but he wasn't alone. From the trees, more figures emerged. 5, maybe 6. They had been surrounding him the entire time. Damn it. Nathan took a sharp breath. He could try to fight, but he wasn't making it out of this without getting shot or worse. Then, before the men could react, Shadow lunged. The dog moved like a ghost, slipping through the darkness and striking like a bullet. A strangled cry cut through the night as one of the men went down hard. Shadow didn't stop. He twisted, bit down on another attacker's arm, and sent him sprawling. "Shit! Get the dog!" Nathan didn't wait. He fired twice, one shot into a tree to scatter them, the second toward a flashlight beam. The light flickered and crashed to the ground. Then he turned and ran. Shadow was already ahead of him, moving like he'd done this 1,000 times. Gunfire cracked behind them, but they had the cover of darkness. The trees were their shield. Nathan knew the terrain better. He could outrun them. As they neared the riverbed, he risked a glance back. The men were regrouping, but they weren't chasing. Not yet. They were still after Shadow. Not Hans gut twisted. If he gave up the dog, he could walk away clean. But he knew deep down that wasn't an option. Whatever Shadow had been a part of, whatever these men were trying to cover up, it wasn't something he could ignore. The dog had been left to die, and Nathan wasn't about to let that happen again. Breathing hard, he looked at Shadow. "Looks like we're in this together." The dog met his eyes. Then, without hesitation, he kept running.